Welcome to the top 12 highlights from Chapter 18. This time we're focused on economic policy, and we're glad you're with us. Let's start by looking at differences between fiscal and monetary policy. Remember, fiscal is the idea that we are traveling down Pennsylvania Avenue on Fiscal Street. The S and the T standing for spending and taxing. This is Congress and the President that basically are handling the spending and taxing in order to try and grow or slow the economy. Monetary policy is regulated by the Fed. That's regulating and basically monitoring the money supply. How much money is out there? Is there too much money chasing too few goods, leading us to inflation? Or is the money supply too tight and more money needs to be out there? So the Fed handles monetary policy, where the Congress and the President handle fiscal policy. Looking at the four phases of the business cycle, you do need to know the difference between the four areas here. We've got peak at the top. You're at the top of your game. Usually you don't know you've reached the peak until business starts to fall. And that leads us to number two, recession or contraction. Businesses close stores. Unfortunately, they're going to have to lay off workers or fire workers. And consumer confidence is usually starting to fall. People aren't spending money as much as they were before. That leads us into trough. Hopefully, there's nowhere to go but up. The end of the recession or contractionary period. And if we stay down here too long, obviously bad recessions lead us to depressionary type of tendencies, because we always get that question. But hopefully we're not there too long, and then we end up in the fourth and final phase of the business cycle, which is recovery or expansion. That's where we want to be. Businesses are opening new stores, they're hiring workers, consumer confidence is on the rise or rising or at an all-time high. And people feel very good about the economy. They're going out and spending money, buying that new home, taking out a loan to send kids to college, or buying a new car, all those types of things. So those are the four phases of the business cycle. How do we measure the health of that economy? Looking at those phases of the business cycle, we do that through three methods, using GDP, inflation, and unemployment. Let's talk about GDP for a second. That's gross domestic product, the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced in a country within a given year. And this is domestic. So it's within our borders, from sea to shining sea is what I always say, and it's within a given year. So think of it from January 1st through December 31st for all final goods and services that are produced. So it's not wood that's being chopped down in a forest somewhere and sold to a home builder. It's the actual home that's being built and sold on the open market. About $17 trillion coming from the U.S. in terms of total GDP in 2015. Now we can look at that number to determine what's in a recession. If there's a decline in the growth of GDP, and usually the last two quarters of negative growth or a decline in growth would lead us to thinking about that in terms of recessionary tendencies. And then depression is those extremely bad times when we're in that recessionary period. Keep in mind that government spending is about a third of our GDP today. So a significant portion of that money comes through government spending, what we talked about through fiscal policy. Now let's look at unemployment for a second, because obviously if people aren't working, they're not spending money. If they're not spending money, then they're not contributing to that increase in GDP. So if we look at the unemployment numbers and we see that unemployment numbers are rising, discouraged workers may be leaving the workforce, or they're staying in, and then the number is rising. That's not a good sign for the health of the economy either. We obviously want people to be joining the workforce because they're finding jobs. Those discouraged workers, those that leave the workforce in order to stay home with the kids, they're coming back to the market. That's a sign of recovery or expansion, not a sign of recession. And then inflation, that general rise in prices. When we take that shopping cart month to month and go through the grocery store and measure the consumer price index, that market basket of goods, we see that prices may be rising. That's not always a good sign. Remember, having a little inflation isn't bad, but a lot of inflation, and especially too quickly, can lead to problems like stagflation, where we saw in the 1970s unemployment was high, so was inflation. Not good, not a good sign for the economy, and really tough to get out of in terms of just using fiscal and monetary policy to do so. So that's really where we want to keep a check on inflation and unemployment. And we saw you were taking a look at the how the Fed does that through monetary policy in terms of trying to regulate that through the federal funds rate or interest rates. Let's talk about that for a second in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. So let's start with fiscal first. We want to grow the economy or we want to slow the economy down. Now, this is different from ideological perspective where one ideology may say, hey, we want to raise taxes and increase spending. This is looking at it from a fiscal point of view, economically, in order to create jobs, grow the economy, keep us in an expansionary period. We're going to grow the economy by increasing government spending and cutting taxes. By doing that, we're putting more money in the consumers' pockets, and they're going out and spending that money in the economy. That leads businesses to create jobs, to expand their businesses, to open new stores or open new locations, and that's helping to grow the economy overall. Conversely, when we want to slow the economy down, why would we want to do that? Because the economy is getting too hot, inflation's rising too fast. We don't want to get into the point that inflation is so high that then people start cutting their spending, which then would lead to people losing their jobs. High unemployment and high inflation, again, takes us back to that stagflation we talked about in the previous slide. So when we slow the economy down, we're going to do the opposite of what we did to grow the economy. We're going to raise taxes instead of cutting them, and we're going to cut government spending instead of increasing it. This is going to lead consumers to have less money in their pockets. It's going to mean that they're not going out and spending money with businesses as much as they were before. So businesses are going to slow that growth. They're going to hire fewer workers. They're not going to open those new stores, or maybe they'll even cut stores or cut back on hours and that sort of thing. And it's going to slow the inflationary tendencies, but also slow the economy down, keep it from getting too overheated. So this is fiscal policy. This is the idea of using taxing and spending, or spending and taxing, by Congress and the president in order to slow or grow the economy. Let's take a look at monetary policy then, and this is the role of the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, in terms of what they do to grow the economy. And this is what we call the BIRD toolbox, B-I-R-D. B for bonds, I for interest rates, R for reserve requirements, and D for the discount rates. We are going to buy bonds, meaning the Fed is going to buy bonds back, giving the consumer money for their bond in order to get them to take that money then and go out and spend it. By spending that money in the economy, it's going to help create jobs, grow businesses, encourage consumers to have the confidence to go out and spend in the economy, and it's going to help grow the economy. So buy to grow and then sell to slow. So the Fed is going to sell bonds in the economy by going out and taking consumers' money, giving them the bond, and that's going to mean they're having less money in their pockets to go out and spend on those new cars and new homes. So it's going to keep the economy from getting overheated, keep inflation from rising too quickly, but that's how we would use B in the BIRD toolbox, bonds in the BIRD toolbox, in order to buy to grow the economy and sell to slow the economy down. And then for the I, R, and the D, the interest rates, the reserve requirements, and the discount rates, we're going to lower those rates in order to grow the economy. We're going to raise those rates to slow the economy down. Let's talk about interest rates for a second, or what the Fed calls the Fed funds rate. This is the rate that is charged to customers to borrow money from a bank. The Fed is going to lower that interest rate in order to grow the economy, because that means people are going to go out and maybe they were on the fence about taking out that loan, and with a lower interest rate, they're going to be more likely to do so. If the rates are higher, they're probably going to be less likely to do so, and that's going to slow the economy down. Reserve requirements is the amount of money a bank is going to need to keep on hand in order to keep a bank run from happening, keep people from coming in and taking out all of their money. So as a result, by lowering those reserve requirements of how much cash a bank needs to keep on hand, it's going to encourage that bank to lend money to consumers. Consumers are going to go out and spend that money buying the new home, buying a new car, spending money on college or on leisure items, and as a result, it's going to help grow the economy. By raising the reserve requirement, the Fed is slowing the economy down because that money is kept in the bank, not in the consumer's hands. They don't have it to go out and spend on the things we just mentioned. So that's going to slow the economy down in that respect. And then we have D for the discount rate, and that is basically the rate that the Fed charges other banks or that banks lend to other banks in order to keep those reserve requirements intact and meeting those reserve requirements that the Fed issues of the money they need to keep on hand. By lowering that discount rate, the banks are going to borrow more money, which is going to give them more money on hand in order to lend out to consumers, and subsequently is going to grow the economy. By raising that discount rate, banks are going to be less likely to borrow money through that discount window, and it's going to slow the economy down. The bank has less money on hand because they borrowed less money, so they're going to have less money to share with consumers through loans, and consumers are going to have less money to spend in the economy, thus slowing the economy down. So this is where we use BIRD, the bonds, interest rates, reserve requirements, and discount rates, to grow the economy by buying bonds and lowering the discount rates or the interest rates or the reserve requirements, and slowing the economy down by selling bonds or raising those rates we just talked about. And then we can see through this that through fiscal policy and monetary policy, there are steps in place that can be taken to grow the economy as well as slow the economy as well. Let's talk about types of spending for a second. We have mandatory spending, and much of this comes from entitlements. The idea of Social Security, Medicare. The president doesn't have a whole lot of leeway to spend money in those areas. You can see here Social Security, over $1 trillion, 33% of the annual budget being spent on Social Security, unemployment, and labor, and 28% spent on Medicare and health down there in the gold pie at the bottom there. Over $1 trillion spent on Medicare and health. That's not money that the president can use as wiggle room to do whatever they want. That's why we call it an entitlement, a mandatory expenditure that the president is spending money on here. Discretionary spending is quite the opposite. This is where Congress and the president get to decide where all of the other money goes. So outside of that 61% that's spent on entitlements, where is the other 39% going to go? Maybe it's to the military, maybe it's to transportation, education, the environment. That's where the president and Congress have some leeway to basically, at their discretion, decide how that money gets spent. Another important term to keep in mind is tax expenditures. These are basically tax breaks that are given to different groups or different businesses or interest groups or people in order to benefit them in some way, in order to encourage them to invest in the economy. And one example here is the mortgage interest deduction. By deducting the interest from your mortgage, what you owe on your home, the consumer is more likely to spend money and invest that money in their home because they have the interest deduction that they can take off their taxes each year. So tax expenditures are a loss of revenue that the government could have, but it's benefiting a group, and it's designed to do something to encourage investment in the economy, and that's where that tax expenditure comes from. So it is an expense because that means less revenue the government's going to have to spend on these items that we talked about here. And that's important to keep in mind when the president's creating that budget, because those types of tax expenditures, those benefits that are paid, mean that the president has less money in discretionary spending to spend in those other places. And that's really where Congress and the president will rely on their ideologies in a lot of cases to basically favor those groups that support them, looking back at those political favors in terms of what tax expenditures are included in their budget. Let's talk about the types of taxes that we have in economic policy. Progressive is simply the more you make, the more they take. If you make more money, you're going to have a higher percentage of your income basically paid to the government in taxes. If you have a lower amount of money, obviously not as much money being paid into the government from your check. Regressive taxes are the opposite of that, and that's basically hitting lower income people harder with things like sales taxes or taxes on food because it's not it doesn't matter. It's basically regardless of how much money you're making, but more of your money is paid out of your income to those taxes, like we mentioned, the taxes on food. That's going to hit a lower income person much harder than someone who's a millionaire and the price of milk going up doesn't really bother them because of a tax on food. And then the last type of tax is a flat or proportional tax, and this is basically where everyone's paying the same percentage of a particular flat tax. A few years ago, many candidates running for president were talking about a flat tax of a particular rate that has been floated in the 2016 election, but not to the same fanfare as we saw back in 2012. But a flat tax is basically everybody paying the same percentage. I think at that point it was 9% they were looking at, and that would be a flat or proportional rate that's paid there. Let's distinguish between deficits and the debt, because this is a common misnomer in terms of students getting them mixed up. The budget deficit is basically how much money the government needs to borrow in order to pay their bills this year, okay? And that's what they're borrowing each year. You can see the deficits out to the right there in terms of the 2016 fiscal year budget was $474 billion. That means we spent as the federal government, they spent more money, $474 billion more money on programs than they brought in taxes and other revenue. So that is a budget deficit. Now, that adds to the overall national debt, which is how much the government owes in total overall through all of these years. And you can see here with this list from FY05 just through FY16 how the numbers really add up. The latest national debt is around $19 trillion, which is about $159,000 per taxpayer. And by the way, if you'd like to make that check out, please do so, and you can pay your fair share. Bad joke, bad joke. But at any rate, what you see here is the deficits are basically the annual, the yearly event that government is basically spending beyond the means of what it's bringing in, and the national debt is basically the overall debt that the country owes based on all of those deficits from year to year, and that's the $19 trillion number. The budget process, we kind of talked about this when we were looking at Congress and the president and the bureaucracy, but the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is working with the president to create the president's budget, and will submit it to Congress. Congress then can decide if they want to take any of the president's budget or just chuck it all together, and they're going to approve a budget through different committees and obviously Ways and Means tying in here, working with House and Senate subcommittees, and then obviously with a conference committee in order to draft something that both houses can approve. They'll send it on to the president. By the way, the CBO will step in to basically run the numbers for Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, working for Congress in that respect to determine how much this budget is going to actually cost. They do that for specific bills as well in terms of determining what will the cost of this bill actually be. And then they'll send it over to the president once both houses have signed off and approved the exact same bill. The president then has the option to sign it, veto it, or pocket veto it. And then basically that is the budget for the federal government for that fiscal year. In terms of government spending, we see a lot of different ways to go about this over the 227 plus years that our country's been in existence. Back in 1985, there was a popular Graham-Rodman balanced budget bill that was approved, and it basically called for sequestration, this idea of cutting, automatically cutting programs and expenditures in order to balance the budget each year. Now, Congress found lots of ways to get around that. The most common that we see today in sequestration was in recent years when President Obama and the Congress agreed to some sequestration cuts if they couldn't agree on a budget. And some things did happen, but again, Congress can always pass a bill, the president can sign it to get around those types of issues. In terms of government spending, many classical economists look at the laissez-faire approach, which is basically get your government's hands off the economy. Let the economy do its own thing and take its own course. Keynesian approaches developed during the Great Depression by John Maynard Keynes in this time period basically said, hey, government should spend in order to help get the economy out of the recessionary or depressionary periods. And if that means that you have to run a deficit in order to do so and spend through deficits, then that's what you need to do in order to help grow the economy. So we've seen these two schools of thought in terms of government spending in order to help leave the economy alone or grow the economy. And then we get to the 1980s with Reaganomics, known for President Ronald Reagan, who basically took a combination of some aspects of what we talk about here with classical and Keynesian, and basically used using the opportunity to cut domestic budgets such as education and social services and increase military spending to kind of show the foreign policy approach he was taking with Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and then also using monetarist policy to control the money supply, going back to monetary policy and looking at interest rates and trying to keep inflation in check with with some moderation. Also looked at cutting personal income taxes, trying to get people to go out and spend that money using fiscal policy to do so. Um, did incur many large deficits, and again, with military spending increasing, you would have to on the Keynesian front. So it did increase the size of the national debt. But some economists and many economists will say that that also helped to stimulate some of the economy in terms of bringing down unemployment, and that recession of the early 80s that they saw tended to decrease as a result of it. Consumer confidence improved, business activity started to increase, jobs were created as a result of it, and this type of approach, this kind of using different aspects of this approach, led to what we call today Reaganomics. Let's shift gears for a moment as we close out these highlights to talk about global trade policy and this idea of protectionism versus free trade. Protectionism is the idea here that we're trying to protect domestic jobs, and we've heard that in this election. The Trump campaign doing a lot with candidate Donald Trump looking at protectionism and trying to keep jobs here. You also heard Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side trying to do that in terms of protecting workers, union workers in particularly, trying to provide them with a fair wage. And focused on the inequities there. All of that tends to come from this school of thought of protectionism. Trade barriers and trade embargoes tend to emanate from this type of thought, using tariffs or taxes on imported goods, quotas. There's only a certain number of goods that you'll bring in, and then embargoes. Some items we won't allow into the country at all in order to protect American jobs. Now, free traders are of the opposite mindset of this protectionism, and the idea there is that free trade is going to allow us to trade with other countries and get American businesses and thus American jobs into those other countries so that we can raise the standard of living for those that are here simply by expanding the number of traders in different countries that we're trading with. And that's going to essentially rising tide raise all boats. Economists tend to be in that school of thought, looking at free trade in that regard. But again, economists aren't elected by elections and by the electorate, the American voter, and so protectionism is alive and well and tends to have definitely resonance with the American voter that we see today. Where do we see some of the global trade organizations tying into this? Well, the World Trade Organization is working to enforce different trade agreements among countries, also trying to level the playing field so that the trade agreements that are agreed to are abided by those countries. That is probably the tendency that happens. Trade agreements are signed, all the pomp and circumstance of a trade agreement, and then they don't follow through on it. And that's probably one of the hardest parts for the World Trade Organization, because there's not a lot of teeth around it in terms of trying to enforce it. GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and this basically looks at what agreements are in place, what taxes are in place, and then what does the WTO need to enforce in terms of those types of agreements. And then in North America, in the US, Mexico, and Canada, we saw NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which basically removed many, if not all, barriers to trade among those three countries. And many economists say that it created new jobs while old jobs disappeared or moved or transferred to other places. The school of thought is that among economists is that it created jobs by allowing new jobs to come up as a result of this free trade. And then lastly, we'll close it out here with this idea of regulation versus deregulation as economic policy.